Time for another build. So the purpose of this build is to build kind of a mini home server. So what this is going to do is serve multiple purposes for different things that I do. It's going to act as a dedicated gaming server. It's going to have dedicated storage for archival of old videos and old images. It's going to run an Adobe Media Encoder so that I can do rendering and other things through it while I'm working on my workstation. And it's also going to serve as a rendering box for some 3D rendering that I'm working on as well. It's going to double as a gaming machine for when I have people over and I want to game with them. It's going to be set up as a host for dedicated games that I want to host 24/7 and play with friends. This video will be split up over a number of videos over the next few weeks, and I'm going to take the time to go through each component and explain why I chose each one. Today we're going to start with talking about the Darkbase Pro 900. Now the reason that this case got onto my radar is because it has enough space to put storage drives and still have enough clearance for an RTX 3090 Founders Edition. The Founders Edition is something that I really wanted to have in my collection, but I don't want to just have it sitting on a shelf because, well, it's an expensive video card. So the idea with the RTX 3090 is that it is a massive card. It takes up a lot of space in a case. There are not a lot of standard or enthusiast cases that can have room for this as well as a whole row of drives. The Darkbase Pro 900 fits that requirement, and so is the perfect choice for this build. Just to emphasize how much space there's in this case, you can see here that the RTX 3090 actually fits in there with plenty of room for the hard drive cages. So I could put a total of 5 hard drive cages on the right hand side and have no issues with fitment for either the motherboard or the graphics card. This certainly isn't the easiest case to disassemble. There's actually a number of screws from the front and in the rear that need to be removed just to remove the power supply shroud. Removing the shroud and getting it back in can be a little bit tricky, but the case can actually be taken apart quite substantially to configure different things that you want to configure. So for example, the power supply goes right here, and there's dust filters on the bottom as well. So you can orient the power supply either up or down for the fan taking in air from inside the case or from below the case. And there's more than enough ventilation and airflow to ensure that you're getting perfect airflow for your power supply. On the power supply shroud, you can actually pop off each of these panels, and they're not too terrible to get out. There's just little plastic clips that you pinch to get out. And then you can actually expose different areas for ventilations, for fans, and different things that you want to put on there. Customize it however you'd like for maximized airflow, or even for putting in radiators and other cooling. Each of the hard drive bay clips can actually be removed from the system, and you can put in one of the 3 provided hard drive bays. Even though there's 5 slots, it only comes with 3 hard drive brackets, so if you want more than 3, you'll have to order additional slots. There is a double hard drive cage that actually goes in the back side as well, and that just slides in here. And if you remove the top 5 1/4 bays, you could actually slot in another double hard drive bay as well in the top. So in this case, you could hold a total of 9 hard drives, depending on what kind of array you want to build. Now most motherboards only support RAID 1, RAID 0, and RAID 10. So if we want to utilize 9 hard drives, I'm going to have to actually buy a RAID controller, which I intend on doing in the future. But that's the nice thing about this case, is it's really expandable. There's a ton of space, and if I want to utilize this case maybe 5 years down the road for another build, say a water-cooled build, there's more than enough room in the case, along with support for 420mm radiators in the top and 360 millimeters in the front. For the power supply for this build, I went with the Seasonic Prime PX1300. And 1300 watts is definitely a little bit of overkill for this system. I wanted to have a good power supply that's going to last for usage as a test bench as well as for any future expansion that I want to do with this particular system. A good power supply should last about 10 years, and this has a 12-year warranty. So I could use this for this build and then for another build in 5 or 6 years if I choose to replace this down the road. One of the things I really like about this power supply is that the power supply is actually rather compact. A lot of 1200 watt, 1600 watt power supplies that I've used in the past are much larger. They're kind of that extended size, where this is more of a standard ATX size. Now in a case this size, having a power supply that's a little bit smaller doesn't really matter because there's so much room in the case, but it will make cable management a little bit easier in the end. The system that I bought earlier this year for myself had the 5950X and an Asus Strix 3090, and it drew just about 900, 905 watts at peak. When I build a system like this, I like to ensure that there's enough power overhead for future expansion or for any additions that I might want to do to the system later. And with speculations of new graphics cards being up to 600 watts in potential power usage, having a little bit beefier power supply could ensure that upgrading to a future GPU will be a lot easier. They made a pretty interesting choice when it comes to power supply installation. They actually decided to include a panel that just kind of passes through the power and has its own switch on and off. So you could just technically leave this panel completely off the case, but it kind of ruins the look. Even though you're not looking at the back, if you build it this way, you're gonna know that you did. So their intention is to have you plug in the cable and then put in the bracket and just kind of tuck everything away inside. And so, I mean, aesthetically, it kind of matches the back of the case, but it is an interesting choice because now you're just adding another cable length that needs to be kind of directly routed in. There is method to this madness, however, because you can actually take the motherboard tray, which includes the back panel as well as the motherboard tray itself, and you can move that up or down. The case also comes with its own fan controller, which currently has 3 Silent Wings 3 fans installed. The Silent Wings 3 fans are really quiet, 140mm fans, that'll move more than enough air to keep this system cooled. But the fan controller has lots of room for additional expansion if I want to add more fans down the road. Now for me, I have no intention of using the 5 1/4 drives. So I'm actually going to remove the front panel and apparently the dust filter that goes with it. And I'm actually going to unscrew and remove the entire 5 1/4 tray. What I really like about this case is that there's just so much that you can do with it as far as customization, removing trays, adding more trays. It can fit so many different components, devices, hard drives, and you can really kind of make it your own. You see that the screw hole here is actually really stripped just from factory. It's going to be really hard for me to get that screw out of there. 3 of the screws were good, but one of them was really just bored right out. But I was able to use a bit tool to actually remove that properly. Now the 5 1/4 tray up here is actually still being held in by some screws in the bottom here, so I'm gonna have to remove the top panel to get those out. So this case is definitely one of those cases that if you love disassembling things, this is the case for you, because it's going to take a really long time to disassemble and customize every individual piece. Now this top piece here is actually the key charger wireless charging unit, which is really cool because I'll be able to just charge my cell phone on top of there. I won't need to plug it in anymore, although wireless charging is quite a bit less efficient than just plugging it in using a cable. It is a pretty cool feature for this case, but I'm going to actually have to take this and remove this as well, because the screws for the 5 1/4 tray are being blocked by this top unit. Okay, now with that out of the way, I can remove the last 2 screws that are holding this tray in place. I'm probably going to need to support it from underneath because it might just fall out. All right, so the tray is pretty loose now. Just slide it out, take that out of there. Since I won't be using that tray, I can just keep it for later. The only downside is that it leaves this kind of this hole here that you can see with that tray out of the way. But the folks over at Be Quiet were kind enough to include a cover panel that'll slide in very nicely to cover that up. Getting these in and out is a little bit challenging, but with a little bit of patience, you can squeeze them in. It's just the problem is on the back, there's 3 separate tabs. You've got to lift all 3 tabs on the bottom and then the top and kind of shimmy it in place. Each of the tabs are actually removable as well if you want to pull out the tabs and use them for cable management. You can move each of these covers forward a little bit and use them as like a cable tray for routing cables as well. All right, there we go. So now that hole's covered up and we have a more finished look for the interior of the case. Now I'll just get everything kind of reassembled here, and then all of the customization that I want to do with this case will be pretty much complete. Now I'll just get the power supply shroud reinstalled, and then that's pretty much it. I'll be ready to move on to getting the motherboard installed and prepped and kind of moving it forward as far as the next steps for the build. Reinstalling the power supply shroud is actually pretty easy. There's just 3 screws in the front, and then there's just 1 in the rear that's kind of connected to where you install your hard drive cages. And then, yeah, it's basically pull it out, put it back in, very easy to pull out and remove and reinstall. Well, now that I'm done customizing the case for the initial look and feel that I'm going for, I'm ready to move on to installing the motherboard, which I'll do in my next video. But I just want to point out that this case has so much space to work with, and there's so much customization that can be done, that for any build where size is an issue of fitting in larger components or water cooling components, this case is definitely good for any of those projects. The fact is, the RTX 3090 is a 313mm card, and this case is one of the very few cases that actually offer 322mm of GPU clearance. That makes this the perfect case for my build. So that's my really quick overview of the Dark Base Pro 900 Revision 2. It's a beautiful case, well thought out, very sturdy, well built, and aside from a couple of those screws being a little bit stripped from factory, this is one heck of a case. Now I'm really looking forward to getting everything else into the case so that I can start using this thing. Well, that's it for this video. And if you want to check out the Asus ProArt X570, stay tuned, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.